Okay, so we've got a really interesting set of sources here, all about Gen Z.
Yeah.
Those born mid-90s to early 2010s.
Uh-huh.
And one thing that really jumps out from all this material is how being digital natives,
Right.
never knowing a world without the internet has,
Oh, yeah.
fundamentally shaped their perspective.
Absolutely. I mean, it's fascinating to see in these sources how that constant immersion in technology, it hasn't just given them access to information. It's really changed
Yeah.
how they process and interact with the world.
Yeah, it's like their native language almost.
It really is.
Yeah.
But it's also important to remember, and your sources highlight this, that they haven't exactly grown up
Right.
during a peaceful, carefree
Oh, no.
period of history,
Right.
right?
Not at all.
They've kind of come of age during some pretty significant global turbulence.
It's true, like economic recessions,
Mm-hmm.
the realities of climate change constantly, sociopolitical movements, and it seems like what's emerged from that is this really pragmatic,
Yeah.
almost hyper-realistic worldview.
Exactly. And I think if we connect that to the bigger picture,
Yeah.
the instability they've witnessed has actually fostered a
Yeah.
real commitment to certain values like authenticity.
Oh, yeah. Your sources talk about that a lot.
Yeah, they can spot inauthenticity a mile away, according to these readings, but also a strong emphasis on inclusivity and social equity.
Right. It's not just talk. They're actually...
Not just lip service.
Yeah, yeah.
They are really engaged with issues like mental health, environmental sustainability,
Uh-huh.
and really pushing for systemic change.
And you can't ignore the role of technology in all of this, right?
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, that constant connectivity, the sheer volume of information they have access to,
Right.
and the ability to organize and mobilize so quickly,
Yeah.
that's fundamental to how they approach activism, as many of your articles point out.
Yeah, and they're good at it.
Yeah.
Like, think about movements like Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
And the climate strikes, your sources really highlight how Gen Z has been so instrumental in their growth and impact, using social media, not just to share information, but to build communities and coordinate action on a huge scale.
It's really remarkable, and I think it demonstrates a level of engagement
Yeah.
with global issues that's pretty unique to this generation.
Right.
So the mission of this deep dive, really tailored to the material you've given us, is to understand this generation's fight for freedom.
Oh.
We're going to look at their experiences,
Yeah.
the core issues driving them, the methods they're using, the challenges they face, and what the future might hold based on, what we see in these sources.
Okay, so let's get into that historical context then, because
Yeah.
it's clear from the timelines you said that, this generation wasn't born into a vacuum. So let's start with 2008, the financial crisis.
Yeah.
A lot of them were pretty young then. But how did that period of widespread economic anxiety shape their later views on freedom and equity, according to what you've read?
Well, it's fascinating because even if they were young, the anxiety and the instability that kind of permeated society, it would have been palpable, in their households and their communities. And your sources suggest that witnessing that fallout from 2008, even at a young age, it instilled in them a real distrust of traditional career paths and fueled this interest in entrepreneurial ventures in the gig economy, seeing traditional employment as inherently unstable.
Yeah.
So their understanding of freedom, I think, became really linked to economic security and a fairer distribution of opportunities. It's a theme that comes up a lot in your articles on their policy preferences.
And then layered on top of that, you have climate change, which is
Right.
ever present and increasingly urgent.
Yes.
And your sources really highlight that this isn't just an abstract concept for them.
Right.
They've grown up with constant news of extreme weather events.
Absolutely. For Gen Z, climate change, it's not some distant future threat.
Mm-hmm.
It's a tangible reality they've witnessed and experienced.
Yeah.
And this has cultivated a very powerful focus on environmental justice. Your readings emphasize that they see the health of the planet as fundamentally intertwined with their basic rights.
Mm-hmm.
The right to a livable environment, clean air, clean water.
Yeah.
Their activism in this area and your sources on youth climate movements really detail this. It's not just about conservation.
Right.
It's about securing their freedom and the freedom of future generations.
Yeah.
The devastating impacts of, environmental degradation.
And then more recently, of course, we all lived through the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yes.
And your sources touch on how that period of profound disruption
Yeah.
had a really unique impact on Gen Z,
Right.
especially those in their late teens and early 20s,
Uh-huh.
with big changes to their education, their social lives, even their sense of personal liberty.
Yeah, it's particularly striking in your material is how the pandemic years really amplified
Oh,
anxieties.
yeah.
For this age group, the disruption to education,
Right.
the social isolation, the pervasive health concerns,
Yeah,
it took a toll on their mental well-being and their social connectivity.
for sure.
As several of your sources on youth mental health indicate,
Yeah.
they experienced firsthand what it meant to have freedoms curtailed for
Uh-huh.
public health reasons.
Yeah.
And while there was often an understanding of why that was necessary, it also really shone a light on existing social and economic inequities,
Yeah.
which further fueled their desire to advocate for those who are most affected.
Yeah.
And the digital platforms, as your articles on online activism highlight, became even more critical.
Yeah.
During this time, serving as the primary means for social mobilization and advocacy when physical gatherings were impossible.
So when you look at the cumulative weight of all these events, right? Economic instability,
Mm-hmm.
environmental crises, global health emergencies,
Mm-hmm.
it paints a picture of a generation that has kind of learned that they can't take things for granted.
I think that's a very accurate assessment.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a real sense of urgency in their desire to fight for what they see as their rights and against these systemic barriers that they're facing.
Exactly. I think their historical context, as you've laid out through these materials, it's been a really powerful and formative influence on their activism.
Yeah.
They've witnessed firsthand the consequences of inaction
Right.
and the fragility of existing systems, and it's led to a belief that that change requires active participation and a willingness to challenge the status quo.
Now, we've touched on it, but let's really dive into how Gen Z is using digital platforms for activism.
Okay.
Because your sources make it clear that social media isn't just where they socialize.
Yeah,
It's a key battleground for their causes.
it is.
So how are they leveraging platforms like TikTok, Twitter, Instagram to actually further their goals according to what you've read?
What your sources consistently emphasize is that social media, it's their native environment.
Yeah.
They navigate it with a fluency that older generations often lack.
Mhm.
They're incredibly adept at using these platforms for mobilization organization
Right.
and rapidly spreading awareness.
Yeah.
Think of it as a decentralized network for activism.
Hmm.
Twitter, as your articles on political discourse highlight, allows for real-time updates on events.
Yeah.
The quick dissemination of information,
Mhm.
Instagram with its visual emphasis, is so powerful for sharing impactful images and personal stories,
Right.
which can humanize complex issues and create these emotional connections.
Yeah.
And TikTok, which several of your sources focus on, has become a hub for incredibly creative activism.
It's so interesting.
Yeah, using short, engaging video formats, often with humor and music, to make serious topics accessible and shareable with a broad audience.
And the power of hashtags too, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Hashtags like Black Lives Matter and Me Too, which are discussed extensively in your articles on social movements,
Yeah.
are prime examples of how a simple tag can connect individual experiences
Right.
to much larger societal issues.
Yeah.
They foster a sense of collective identity and enable people from all over the globe to participate in a shared conversation and a shared movement, and the sheer scale and speed
It's unbelievable.
at which these movements have grown online, it's documented in your sources, it's really remarkable.
And the speed at which information spreads is incredible.
Or it's lightning fast.
News videos, firsthand accounts,
Mm-hmm.
it's almost instantaneous, and that must create a real sense of urgency.
It does. That immediacy is a critical factor highlighted in your readings on digital communication.
Yeah.
When people can see and hear directly from those who are affected by injustice
Right.
in real time,
Yeah.
it creates a powerful emotional resonance and a sense of urgency that traditional media might not capture.
Right?
It bypasses those traditional gatekeepers and allows for a much more direct and unfiltered narrative,
Yeah.
fostering a sense of immediacy and that feeling that action is required now.
And the creativity, too, on platforms like TikTok, which some of your sources really focus on. It's just fascinating.
It is.
I've seen examples of incredibly effective activism done through these really short, engaging videos.
Yeah.
Using humor, personal narratives, really clever visuals to get these serious messages across
Right.
in a way that just resonates with a huge audience.
What your sources really illuminate is that Gen Z is repurposing these platforms originally designed for entertainment into really effective tools for social change.
Yeah.
They intuitively understand the language of these platforms and how to create content that not only grabs attention,
Right.
but also encourages engagement and sharing,
Yeah.
often blending entertainment with education in very innovative ways.
But of course, your sources also touch on the downsides of this reliance on social media for activism.
Right.
The spread of misinformation
Yes.
seems like a huge challenge.
That's a crucial point that's raised in several of your articles on the challenges of online activism.
Yeah.
The speed at which misinformation can proliferate
Yeah.
is a major concern.
It's scary.
False narratives can gain traction so quickly, potentially undermining the goals and the credibility of legitimate movements.
Yeah.
So your readings emphasize the need for activists and individuals to be incredibly vigilant about fact-checking and ensuring the accuracy of the information they share and amplify.
And then there's the echo chamber effect, right?
Yeah.
Where people primarily see and hear from those who already agree with them.
Yes.
And your sources discuss whether this actually limits the potential for broader understanding and meaningful change.
That's a valid concern that your sources on online polarization address.
Yeah.
When individuals are predominantly exposed to viewpoints that reinforce their existing beliefs,
Right.
it can hinder critical thinking and make it harder to engage constructively with different perspectives.
Yeah.
So this is where the need for deliberate effort in navigating the digital landscape and actively seeking out diverse viewpoints becomes crucial for fostering broader understanding and achieving meaningful societal change, as some of your more critical sources point out.
So despite these challenges, social media remains this really vital and powerful tool in Gen Z's fight for freedom.
It does.
So let's delve into the specific issues then that are fueling their activism, according to what you've read.
Okay.
What are the key areas that they're most concerned about?
Well, your sources consistently place climate change at the forefront. And this isn't just an environmental issue for them. It's deeply intertwined with their sense of justice and their future well-being.
Yeah.
They're intensely focused on advocating for reduced emissions,
Right.
a swift transition to renewable energy sources, and the widespread adoption of sustainable practices.
Yeah.
They see this as absolutely integral to their freedom, given the disproportionate impact that environmental degradation will have on their generation and on marginalized communities, a point your readings on environmental justice underscore.
And racial justice is another issue that comes up again and again in these materials.
It does.
And the Black Lives Matter movement in particular seems to have galvanized a lot of young people.
Absolutely. Gen Z has demonstrated a profound and sustained commitment to dismantling systemic racism
Yeah.
and promoting racial justice, according to your sources on contemporary social movements.
Right.
They exhibit a strong understanding of the interconnectedness of various forms of oppression,
Right.
what's often referred to as intersectionality,
Yeah.
and are actively involved in movements like Black Lives Matter,
Yeah.
pushing for accountability, combating discrimination in its various forms, and advocating for genuine and diverse representation across all sectors of society.
Yeah.
Their core belief, as highlighted in your readings on social equity, is that true freedom cannot exist without equity for all,
Right.
regardless of race or ethnicity.
And LGBTQ+ rights is another area where Gen Z is demonstrating a very strong and vocal advocacy, according to your sources.
Yes. Your materials clearly show that Gen Z is a powerful and consistent ally for LGBTQ+ rights. They're deeply committed to fostering a society that's fully inclusive and accepting of all individuals. Regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity,
Right.
they actively work to challenge and dismantle societal norms that perpetuate prejudice and discrimination,
Yeah.
striving for a world where everyone can experience the same freedoms and rights without fear of marginalization or violence.
We're also seeing this significant focus on economic inequality in your sources.
Yes.
If it seems that growing up during these periods of economic uncertainty has made them really attuned to these disparities.
That's a key insight from your readings on socioeconomic trends.
Yeah.
Gen Z recognizes the systemic barriers that contribute to significant disparities in wealth and opportunity.
What?
They're very vocal in their support for policies that aim to create a more equitable society,
Yeah.
such as, the concept of universal basic income,
Right.
advocating for fair living wages,
Yeah.
and pushing for affordable access to higher education. They view these not just as economic policies, but as fundamental building blocks for ensuring broader freedom. and opportunity for a wider spectrum of the population.
And it's interesting to see the prominent role that mental health awareness plays for this generation.
Yes.
Highlighted in several of your sources. It seems they are much more open and proactive about discussing these issues compared to previous generations.
Mental health awareness has gained significant traction with Gen Z, as your sources clearly indicate.
Yeah.
Having come of age in a rapidly evolving and often anxiety-inducing world,
Right.
they possess a heightened awareness of the importance of mental well-being.
Oh, wow.
They actively advocate for increased access to mental health resources and support services,
Right.
working to destigmatize mental health challenges
Yeah.
and cultivate a more supportive and understanding society.
So these are all incredibly important issues.
They are.
And it's one thing to be aware and concerned,
Right.
but Gen Z has shown this real commitment to taking action,
Yes.
through protests and various forms of activism. And your sources detail some really powerful examples of youth-led movements in recent years.
Yes, they do.
So let's look at a couple of those case studies, starting with the March for Our Lives in 2018.
Okay, the March for Our Lives, which is covered extensively in your articles on gun control advocacy,
Yeah.
was a truly pivotal moment. In the aftermath of that tragic shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School,
Right?
the student survivors, they didn't just grieve.
Yeah.
They immediately organized.
That's amazing.
They channeled their intense outrage and grief into this really powerful and highly visible movement, demanding stricter gun control legislation.
Yeah.
And the sheer scale of those protests, with an estimated 800,000 people
Wow.
participating in Washington, D.C. alone, and millions more globally.
Yeah.
It powerfully amplified Gen Z's voice and demonstrated their remarkable ability to mobilize rapidly
Right.
and demand tangible policy changes.
And then just a couple of years later, the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020 were another just massive and impactful display of youth-led activism.
Absolutely. The murder of George Floyd served as this stark catalyst for an unprecedented wave of protests
Yeah.
against systemic racism and police brutality events, which your sources detail in depth.
Yes.
Gen Z was absolutely instrumental
Yeah.
in both organizing and actively participating in those demonstrations, both online and in person across the globe.
It was incredible.
Social media played a vital role in disseminating information, documenting events in real time, and rallying widespread support on a global scale.
Yeah.
The extensive discourse and the sustained pressure generated by these protests really compelled a broader societal reckoning
I accept.
with issues of racial injustice,
Yeah.
and further empowered Gen Z to assert their collective power
Right.
in demanding accountability and systemic reform.
And we can't overlook the climate strikes,
Yes.
which your sources highlight as being significantly inspired by Greta Thunberg and the Fridays for Future movement. That's been another incredibly compelling example of young people demanding urgent action on a global scale.
Greta Thunberg's initial individual action, as your sources document,
Yeah.
ignited a truly global phenomenon.
It's amazing.
Millions of young people around the world have actively participated in these climate strikes, demanding immediate and meaningful action from global leaders
Yeah.
to address the escalating climate crisis.
Right.
And their profound frustration
Oh, yeah.
with the perceived inaction of previous generations is palpable in their messaging.
Yeah.
And these widespread protests have been remarkably effective in raising public awareness and pushing that urgent issue of climate change to the forefront
Right.
of political discussions worldwide.
Yeah, it's really put it on the agenda.
It has.
So these case studies really underscore the significant power and tangible impact of youth-led activism.
Yes, they do.
It's clearly not just about raising awareness. It's about actively shaping the conversation and pushing for real, concrete change. But it can't be easy.
No.
So what are some of the major challenges that Gen Z activists are facing, according to the sources you've examined?
Your sources consistently point to a few key challenges.
Okay.
One significant hurdle is pushback and a lack of understanding or support from older generations
Right.
who may not grasp their perspectives or agree with their chosen methods of activism.
Yeah, it's a different world.
It is.
Yeah.
And this can manifest as dismissive attitudes, reluctance to engage in meaningful intergenerational dialogue, or even outright opposition,
Right.
creating this frustrating divide.
That makes sense. I mean, it can be really challenging to bridge those gaps in lived experience and understanding.
It can.
What about political resistance?
Yes.
Because I imagine that actively pushing for systemic change often meets with some pretty significant opposition
It does.
from those in power.
Absolutely. When activists challenge those established power structures,
Uh,
they often encounter defensive reactions
right.
from political leaders and institutions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Your readings on political activism detail how this can take various forms, like the introduction of legislation aimed at limiting the right to protest,
Wow.
increased surveillance of activist groups, or the deliberate spread of disinformation
Right.
to undermine their efforts.
Gosh.
This kind of political resistance can create a chilling effect and make it more difficult and even risky
Yeah.
for young people to exercise their fundamental rights.
To free speech and assembly.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I have to imagine that the constant engagement with these often really heavy and complex issues,
Uh-huh.
coupled with just the pressures of, their own lives,
Right.
can take a real emotional and mental toll on the activists themselves.
It can.
Burnout must be a significant risk.
Activist burnout is a very real and serious concern that's highlighted in your materials.
Yeah.
Gen Z activists often juggle their demanding advocacy work with their education, their part-time jobs, their personal lives.
Right. They're still young.
They are. And the cumulative emotional and physical demands.
Yeah. Of continuous engagement with these challenging social and political issues, it can be immense,
Yeah.
leading to exhaustion, disillusionment, and even withdrawal from activism,
Right.
which can ultimately limit their long-term impact and the sustainability of their movements.
And then in this digital age, the potential for government surveillance
Yes.
and online censorship,
Yeah.
especially given their reliance on online platforms, must also be a concern.
That's a valid and important point raised in your readings on technology and social movements. The increasing awareness of that heightened digital monitoring and the potential for online censorship
Right.
can create a climate of apprehension among activists.
Yeah.
The fear of surveillance can discourage open dialogue, the free exchange of critical ideas, and the uninhibited organization that's often fundamental to effective activism.
Right.
Transparency and accountability are so crucial
If
for
con-
these movements to thrive.
Uh-huh.
And the perception or reality of surveillance can really undermine that trust and openness.
So despite their passion, their energy, their digital savvy Gen Z activists are navigating some pretty significant hurdles.
They are.
So let's shift our focus a bit now and consider the role that education plays in all of this.
Okay.
How can schools and universities actually foster this spirit of activism and civic engagement in young people based on your readings?
Your sources on youth development and civic education consistently emphasize that educational institutions
Yeah.
have a truly crucial role to play in shaping Gen Z's beliefs and empowering them to become active and engaged citizens.
Uh-huh.
One key way is through the intentional and thoughtful integration of social issues into the curriculum.
Okay, so like in the classroom.
Yes, courses in history, political science, sociology, even literature can provide students with a deeper understanding of the historical roots and contemporary manifestations of social injustices,
Right.
inspiring them to think critically
Uh-huh.
and work towards a more equitable future.
That makes sense. Giving them that foundational knowledge and their historical context is a really critical first step.
It is.
What about beyond the traditional classroom setting?
Yeah.
How can extracurricular activities and student-led organizations contribute to fostering activism?
Your sources on student engagement highlight that extracurricular programs and student-led organizations that focus on specific causes, whether it's environmental sustainability, racial equality, LGBTQ+ rights, or any other area of social concern,
Right.
provide invaluable practical opportunities for students to learn how to organize, mobilize their peers,
Right.
and develop crucial leadership skills.
It's like hands-on experience.
It is. They gain firsthand experience in working collaboratively, effectively voicing their opinions, and taking collective action on issues they care about, both within their school communities and in the wider world.
And creating the right kind of inclusive and supportive environment within those educational institutions seems really important
It is.
for nurturing this spirit of activism.
Absolutely. Your sources on inclusive education emphasize that schools need to actively cultivate environments where students feel safe and empowered to discuss sensitive and often controversial topics,
Right.
openly and respectfully to share diverse perspectives without fear of judgment, and to engage in constructive debates.
It's so important to have those open conversations.
It is encouraging open dialogue and respectful disagreement is absolutely essential for empowering young people
Yeah.
to become informed, active, and engaged participants in shaping a more just and equitable society.
So it sounds like education has the potential to be a really powerful force in nurturing the next generation of activists.
I agree.
So looking ahead now, what do you think the future of Gen Z activism might look like?
Okay.
Based on the trends and insights you've gleaned from these materials,
Yeah.
how might their methods and their areas of focus evolve in the coming years?
Given their inherent digital fluency, which is a recurring theme in your sources,
Yeah.
we're likely to see continued innovation and adaptation in their advocacy methods.
Uh-huh.
They'll undoubtedly continue to leverage existing and emerging technologies
Right.
in increasingly sophisticated ways.
Yeah.
Social media platforms will remain crucial for facilitating discourse,
Right.
raising awareness on a massive scale,
Yeah.
and building and sustaining communities of action.
Uh-huh.
But we might also see them exploring and adopting new digital tools and strategies.
Right, to kind of stay ahead of the curve.
Exactly.
And what about the core issues that they'll be focusing on, the ones we've already discussed?
Yeah.
Climate change,
Yeah.
racial injustice, economic inequality.
Mm-hmm.
Your sources suggest these aren't going away anytime soon.
No, unfortunately, your readings strongly indicate that these fundamental and deeply entrenched challenges
Right.
will likely continue to shape the primary focus of Gen Z activism.
Yeah.
However, as they gain more experience in advocacy
Uh-huh.
and potentially encounter setbacks,
Right.
we might observe a strategic shift towards more disruptive forms of action or a greater emphasis on building strategic alliances with diverse stakeholders.
Interesting.
For instance, your sources suggest they might increasingly seek to partner with businesses and political entities, leveraging concepts like corporate social responsibility
Okay.
as a means of achieving their broader goals.
That's a really interesting point about forming these strategic alliances.
Yeah.
And we're already seeing this growing understanding of intersectionality in their activism,
Yes.
as we discussed earlier.
Right.
Do you think that trend of cross-movement collaboration
I do.
will continue to strengthen in the future?
I think so. The recognition that various forms of oppression and injustice are interconnected is a growing and powerful understanding within Gen Z activism, as your sources on social justice highlight.
Yeah.
I anticipate that we'll see even stronger and more effective alliances
Right?
being forged between different marginalized groups and movements, creating a more unified and potentially more powerful force for systemic change
Yeah.
by recognizing their shared struggles and common goals.
And ultimately, based on the trends you've identified in these sources, how might Gen Z's activism influence future generations?
Okay.
Will their commitment and methods set a precedent for civic engagement?
Your readings on intergenerational influence strongly suggest that Gen Z's demonstrated commitment to advocacy, their innovative use of technology, and their willingness to challenge the status quo could very well serve as a significant inspiration for subsequent generations.
Interesting.
They're effectively setting a new precedent for civic engagement and social responsibility, demonstrating the potential power of collective action and digital organizing.
Yeah.
Their legacy could very well be a more engaged and proactive citizenry for many years to come.
So we started this deep dive by asking, will Gen Z rise to the challenges of their time
Right.
and actively fight for freedom, or will they remain silent?
Uh-huh.
And after examining their background, their formative experience, that the challenges they face, their dynamic methods of activism,
Yes.
what's your concluding thought?
I think what your sources overwhelmingly demonstrate
Yeah.
is that their very nature as digital natives,
Yeah.
combined with the strong and deeply felt social consciousness forged by the unique circumstances of their upbringing, inherently equips them to mobilize and advocate effectively.
So they're not silent.
They are far from silent.
Yeah.
They are actively and creatively shaping the discourse on critical issues,
Right.
leveraging the powerful tools at their disposal
Yeah.
to raise widespread awareness and organize collective action.
So it's less about a lack of voice then,
I think so.
and more about just the accessibility and the innovative use of avenues for expression and organization
Exactly.
in this digital age.
And what emerges as crucial from your readings is the importance of engagement,
Right.
intergenerational solidarity, where older generations can offer their experience and resources
Right.
while also learning from the fresh perspectives.
Yeah.
And digital fluency of younger activists is essential for amplifying their impact and fostering lasting change.
So given the urgency of the issues they're confronting
Mhm.
and the potential for Gen Z to drive meaningful change,
Mm-hmm.
it really does seem that their trajectory points towards a rise rather than silence.
I think so.
And it prompts us to consider our own roles in all of this.
Yes.
How can we support their endeavors and contribute to building a more just and equitable world?
That's the question.
What kind of legacy of empowerment are we helping to shape? It's something to think about.
It is.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.